Good morning, all.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. We are at the policy committee meeting. I'm just making sure that we have Mr. Brown, so we have quorum. He's joining us remotely today.
I am on. Good morning.
Great, thanks, Dave. So we will begin this meeting just as a quick recap. What we had decided last meeting as we were going through this policy audit was to go through all of the policies. We began with the administration series, which is the 2000 series. And we have learned, at least Marge and I have learned from going through this process. We may have some recommendations as we go forward, but we met with the attorneys and we had them give us recommendations on every policy that we currently had in the administrative series. It was a lot of work, so thank you to the policy committee members for wading through all of these policies. As you'll see in the memo dated March 18th from Mrs. Sion and myself, there are recommendations from Shipman on what we should do with these policies. Often, Ms. Smith notes that we don't need to have a policy because it is covered by statute. However, we still have the choice to have a local policy should we so choose. We just need to be aware then that we need to constantly be monitoring that and making sure that we are in accordance with policy, because sometimes policy can be overly prescriptive. And if you choose to have one, the onus is on you to make sure that it's there and that it's being effectuated properly. So we can go through these one by one. I'm interested in knowing what committee members would like to do, especially on policies that are not required by statute. I will tell you some of them I think we should let go of. Some I think there's actually some value in having just our local practice codified somewhere, but I would look for recommendations. So without objection, I'd like to start with board policy 2100, goals of the administrative body. The recommendation is to repeal this policy. The policy is not legally required and seems unnecessary in that it does not appear to articulate a specific goal or vision of the Darien Public Schools. Were there committee thoughts on this particular policy? Mrs. Best.
I would say I think the recommendation to repeal makes sense. It seems super vague to me. I don't see where it adds value.
Okay, Mr. Brown.
Yeah, no comment, Tara.
Okay, I would happen to agree that this seems more like a job description to me than a policy, and that given that there's nothing we're really requiring or any action a board would take regardless, that this seems more of a human resource superintendent management issue. So my recommendation in my report to the board would be to repeal this policy without objection. Okay, policy 2210, duties of the superintendent. Committee members?
Tara, the only comment I would make is looking at these going forward is have we reconciled against the current superintendent's contract to make sure all the elements are included in these various policies that we're looking to remove?
Yeah, I feel similarly, Mr. Brown. I think having this policy, which also reads more like a job description to me, the onus is on the board to make sure when they both go out and solicit for superintendents and or write a contract to true up to this policy. I wonder if it could be overly prescriptive. It feels like a job description to me. I do see value in making sure the public knows what the superintendent's duties are. I'm just concerned that this feels prescriptive and reads more like a job description than a policy.
No, I appreciate that comment. My concern is that if we look at the current superintendent contract, which we're obviously not going to go and modify, or at least I don't believe we're going to at this juncture, then if we eliminate these items that are in our policy, are they all contained in the current contract? Because we're not going to change it. So my point is, if we take these away from our policy? Are they all contained in the contract, where we now have gaps? Because sure, these should be in the contract, and yeah, they are like a job description, and maybe they should be somewhere else. But if we eliminate them, then they won't actually be anywhere else.
True. So I think what you're highlighting is, one, the board's responsibilities to create and sign a contract. And do we want to codify for boards going forward that these things must be in a contract? You'll note that Ms. Smith puts down what the general statute requires.
Correct.
I think this is really, you could really go either way.
Well, I guess, so I go on a go forward basis, I agree. But we do have the current state of play with the current contract. So unless we would like to renegotiate the contract to make sure all of these items are included, we could have gaps. And so I'm just looking to not take anything out until we reconcile against the current contract to make sure we don't create gaps through this process.
Okay, Mrs. Best?
I would agree. It's my understanding that most of these things are included in the current contract as I read the materials. So, but I agree. I want to make sure that these are captured, but this feels more like a job description to me than a policy.
Agreed. This was a general comment, and I have not reconciled against the final contract, so I don't know for a fact, and it may all well be covered. I'm just highlighting that point, and again, looking not to create gaps in what we like to have or statutorily have versus what's in the current contract.
So then would it be acceptable to the committee if I go through, I reconcile the contract, this policy, and then if there's anything of concern, we can talk about it as a full board and we can flag it. But in general, we think that this policy on a go forward basis is more of a job description than an actual policy. Is that a
I think
fair
that's
way to report out?
Yeah, I think that sounds fine process wise. And again, I just haven't done that work with the contract. So as long as we do that, then that sounds great.
Okay. I will do that process. If there's any red flags, I will present it to both the committee prior to board meeting, and I will present it to the full board on Tuesday. Policy 2220, the recruitment and appointment of the superintendents of schools. The recommendation is to repeal this policy as it is not legally required and seems unnecessary. One, the board is required to elect a you guys can read this, but for the public, the Superintendent Statute, and it permits the board to take appropriate steps to select a superintendent, which the board could take with or without policy. And the general policy, the general statute is quoted. Are there any specific concerns, questions around this policy or recommendations?
Not from me.
No comment.
Okay. Are we comfortable taking the recommendation to repeal as we report out to the board?
I am.
I am as well.
Great. Superintendent's contract. This is where I'm going to pull out policy 2230. I think you all have it in your packet with the track changes. This is another one that the recommendation is to repeal, given that the board is required to elect a superintendent by law, and given that the board must agree to the terms of a contract. Mr. Brown, I think this is also goes to your earlier concern that given the board must agree and enter into a contract, we want to make sure there are no conflicts.
Correct.
But are there any other comments on 2230?
No, not for me.
Nope, I'm
Okay.
good.
And then so is the board comfortable repealing, again, making sure that there's no conflicts we should currently be aware of? Although on this one, I don't believe there are, since we set the contract with this in mind.
I'm comfortable.
Okay, Mr. Brown?
It's all good.
Great. Superintendent of schools, opportunities for development, repeal this policy. The provisions are more appropriate for inclusion in the contract than in the board policy. We do include currently, and we have in the past, opportunities for development into contract. I would just tell you, having negotiated superintendent contracts, I would also find that this policy is unnecessary. I think that's a negotiation tool for the board and often for supers, and having a policy saying that it must exist in some ways ties the board's hands. I'm sorry, Mr. Superintendent, but in the best interest of the town and the district as I negotiate contracts, this one, I don't know, it should be policy as much as negotiation.
I agree with that.
Mr. Brown?
That's fine.
Okay, now the superintendent of schools 2250 evaluation. The recommendation is to repeal this policy as it is not legally required and seems unnecessary. We do, as by statute, evaluate the superintendent every year. I will say that at times during my tenure, this issue has come up because in some ways our policy has been prescriptive about an evaluation in writing. Some people felt that that was necessary. Some people felt that districts had moved to oral evaluations. I think this is one that is up for discussion, and I'd love to hear how board members feel. Sorry, committee members feel. Any thoughts?
I'd like to include it because we may go to a semi-annual as we have done this year, and that perhaps having it in the policy would allow us a place to do that.
Sorry, Dave, I just missed the end of what you said.
I said retaining this as policy would allow us the opportunity to change the periodicity if we want to do quarterly, annually, semi-annually. So I'd like to keep it in there as a placeholder for that.
Okay. Often that what comes up, and I will just point out because we're doing a full audit, is the annual written evaluation. Most districts do not require something in writing. Do we want to flag that for the board as something to discuss whether they reaffirm that they would like that or that they would like to make a change? I don't know that that's our decision to make, but I do think that's where the question has most often come up in my tenure. Do we retain written?
Well, my question is to written, aren't there larger issues around whether a document's written or not versus a conversation? And different rules that we have to operate under?
So there is not a statute that requires us to write. We've done a fair amount of research on this. Darien has had written, and there at times people have questioned, why do we have a written? Why was that still required? Other times people wanted to see the written, which is fine. But I will tell you that it's whether it's written or not has come up. So if the board was to ask us, why are you looking at this policy? I would say the question that most often comes up is, do we want to retain the requirement that an evaluation be written?
So I would kick this to the board for this further discussion would be my recommendation.
Agreed.
I agree with that.
Yep.
It could also, Ms. Ackman, also just align to the contract as well.
So as part of contracts, you have to agree on terms in terms of evaluation. At the moment, this is our policy. So again, when the contract gets written, this is where we stand and what we have to have. So it's really not negotiation, but I would agree with Mrs. Best and Mr. Brown that since this has come up, this is a full board discussion, whether they want to change this. I would also say that this is one that at the moment, I think is a good policy to retain, even though it is a local policy, in my opinion. But that I would say to the board on an ongoing basis, this is one to look at as the process evolves. I think we've made a lot of steps in kind of following a CABE process for evaluation now rather than a more local one. And so we are solidifying that more and more. So this is one I would keep currently, but I would flag to say the board may want changes in the future.
Sounds good.
Unavailability of the superintendent policy 2260. There are proposed revisions that specify the development of a hierarchy of administrative succession in the event the superintendent is temporarily unavailable. And that consultation should happen with the Board of Education. This policy has been revised to include additional reasons when the board chair would convene a special meeting to to appoint an acting or interim superintendent. Having had been in that position, I really like the changes that have been proposed. So I am in supportive of the revisions. Any other, is there anyone else have any discussion on this?
I'm good.
Mr. Brown?
No discussion, Tara.
Okay, so we will recommend to accept the revisions to this policy. The administrative team, policy 2310, proposed revisions to confirm that the Board of Education will appoint any administrative personnel that the board determines necessary for the efficient and effective operations of the school. I agree with the proposed revisions. Does anyone have any comments or discussion?
What was the history of this one? It was weird. Do you have any background?
Sure. The history is that it's a really old policy.
All of these policies were adopted on the same date, adopted, not revised. It was, do we
Yes.
know any history on?
Yeah, so there was a big policy audit and review.
Okay,
And they kind of all came in as a batch.
okay.
It's 2008. I was not part of
No,
that.
I know you were.
I was not part of that.
And I don't
so-
even know if it's relevant. I was just curious as to why they all came at once about this topic.
I think the history is just that if you ever have a situation where you really need to figure out how this works and your superintendent, the board has to act quickly to have something in place. To me, COVID, I could see where this could have come into play. Thank God we didn't have to. But I also like that it's that the board determines to be necessary and efficient or effective. I really think that helps with kind of our oversight and management and clarifies this policy. But that's about all the history I have on it. It did come in in 2008. It had not been in place beforehand.
I just think it'd be useful at some point to clarify what we mean by administrative personnel. It seems obvious, but at some point we can clarify that.
My question on this was, might there be budget implications to this? Or is that just assumed that would be figured out? That might be a newbie question.
Well, of course, there'll be budget if we stick somebody on a team unless they're doing it for free.
So here's the other thing. Goes to hiring. So we delegate the hiring of teachers to the administration. We retain the ability to appoint and hire administrative staff. And I think what that really is those are your leadership and really, teachers do wonderful work. So I don't mean this in a negative way, but this is really your staff in central office. And that is the board's job to hire. We are affirming that we are not delegating that. And so if someone needs to be happening, and this happens for principals or the superintendent doesn't just appoint, the board meets.
Okay.
And that is a part of a board decision as leadership.
Okay.
So that's part of how I read this.
That's how we've been operationalized.
Yeah. And I think that I would say for oversight of a board, I find that very important.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
And I think the board has extended flexibilities where we have needed that under special circumstances.
Is anyone comfortable? Is there anything else on this policy?
So on 2310, my thought is to keep it. I think it gives us some flexibility, but maybe a broader discussion.
I'm sorry, Dave, it's a little blurry.
Oh, sorry. I said I like the flexibility this provides, and I think it may be a broader discussion. My inclination would be to keep it.
Okay, agreed. I would keep
Good
it
with
with
that.
revisions as suggested. I think in that case, it actually supports the Board of Education more fully and accurately. Policy 2410, dissemination and implementation of policies and administrative regulations. Proposed revisions to this policy clarify that superintendent has the discretion to direct that a handbook be developed for staff and that the handbook contain relevant policies. Ms. Smith has suggested that it may be preferable to repeal this policy, but include the provision as part of the district's internal procedures. I actually like that recommendation. I think that the handbook and the development of it is an administrative duty. The board has never had a role in that. And so this policy seems as if it is work we say we're doing that we are currently not. So unless someone believes the board should get involved in the creation and dissemination of the handbook, all the policies would have to match our umbrella policies anyway. I just haven't seen any board work. This is one of those policies where I haven't seen us doing it, and it sits here, and I'm not sure that a board ever would. So thoughts?
I think it makes sense to repeal. I agree with that.
If we don't use it, let's lose it.
Okay, now this had revisions 2410. Although, just so you know, I agree with the suggestion from the attorneys to repeal. So we'll put that on for repeal. Uniform policy 2420, uniform treatment of recruiters, proposed revisions to update the legal references to clarify that these requirements pertain to all secondary school students and not only to high school students. That seems a no-brainer to me. Everyone comfortable with that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so this was in some ways the most interesting policy. Policy 2610, the annual report to the school district. The recommendation is to repeal this policy as it is not legally required. We also did some homework around it, and nobody did it. They understand that there's a state statute mentioning it. Nobody puts it into practice. And in fact, legal was going to do some conversations of why is this still sitting in statute, since it's actually not effectuated by any Board of Education or district that we could find. That said, I do think we satisfy the intent of it in that we have quarterly updates on our goals. And I would say I really commend, the boards of education before us, but especially, within the last decade, we have really codified that process of annual updates on goals. So by the time we reach the new year, we have seen a full report on the goals and the objectives and how they have been achieved or whether there's still work to be done. But given that nobody does this, that legal is actually looking into whether the statute can actually be amended because it's really not effectuated anywhere, I would suggest we repeal this and in consultation with the superintendent, come up with a process for how we would like to see updates. But I don't think any of us are currently nor want to maybe be hemmed in by only getting an annual report in December. I think our quarterly reports and updates are probably far more beneficial to the district. So this would be one I would recommend for repeal. But I am open to thoughts and conversation of committee members.
I would support repealing this. Just to understand, are you suggesting that we should consider changing our process for quarterly updates? Or are you saying that what we have in place is working and we should formalize it?
Well, I think that's a conversation for the board. I currently think our process works, but if the board wants to have a discussion about how to have updates, we've done that in the past. But this current policy, to Dave's earlier good point, we don't do it. Nobody around us does it. Nobody can understand what the statute really is. They feel like, my words, it may be kind of a leftover vestige of older times that just hadn't been codified. But we don't do it. And so I would much rather have this board work and affirm on what we do, whether that's policy or practice, than have a policy that quite frankly, someone could point to and say, you're not doing this as described here.
And I think that's the bigger question for me, Tara, is that somebody could point and say you're not following policy. Likewise, someone can point and say you're not following statute. Just because nobody else does it doesn't relieve the statutory obligation. So looking at this one, there's another question there is, well, maybe we should be doing something and have this in a file somewhere. So to me, this is not something I would just sweep away. I'm curious as to what the state of play is. Would like to hear more from council as to how they're looking at this and maybe whether there'll be a revision before we make a decision on removing this. And if we haven't been complying with statute, then I think we need to start complying with statute. So I think this is good that it's been highlighted, but nobody else does it. Doesn't mean we don't have to do it.
So I think as of you, so Marge, do you want to go?
I did just want to say that Ms. Smith put out an email to the entire law firm and no one even knows how to interpret the statute. No one knows what 3 weeks before the annual town or regional school district, because I did ask for that information. What would it take for us to implement the statute? And it was crickets.
Mr. Superintendent.
Yeah, just the only other thing I would say that would contribute towards this just in practice is that I work very closely with the board chairs on the annual report to the town on the state of the schools that we do annually every year. So in addition to the things you've mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I think that, that there's other things that we do that align to that, and actually I would say qualify in some capacities.
So why don't we do this? Because I know even as of this morning, we were checking on this policy to see if there was any more clarification. Why don't we, as you all know, I'm like a big statute fan, and I agree with Mr. Brown's point. If there's a statute, we should be following it. However, if nobody knows how to actually implement this statute, we're kind of in a quagmire. So why don't we, just like we said, the earlier one, we'll do a little more work on it, figure out what this would even look like, right? And if there's no actual way to even implement it, because the annual town or regional school district meeting, we don't really have. Why don't we do a little work? And if it's just impossible to comply because the statute is so vague, we can begin that legal work separately and kind of hold this policy as one that the statute hasn't been clarified. Does that make everyone comfortable? And if I get more information that would clarify it for us, I will report in on Tuesday's meeting to the board.
And that makes sense to me, I would say. And is there possibly potential that we're already delivering against this once we understand what it is they're
Yes.
looking for with all of the reports and updates that we already get? We may be satisfying this.
We may be satisfying this, and it may be so open to interpretation. But I would say this. I think that when we have kind of these vague leftover, it's better than to leave the state statute. So when we talk about repealing, we're just talking about repealing local and saying we will comply with state statute. And now what we're doing is we're trying to understand, do we currently satisfy statute, or is there something we need to do? But given that this is so vague, I am slightly uncomfortable having a local policy around it. So my overall recommendation would still be to repeal and then to understand how the Board of Education is satisfying a state statute. Is that a fair way to report out on it, everybody?
That makes sense to me, yes.
I think so. I don't have enough information to go one way or the other right now, Tara. So let's see what we get in.
Okay, happy to do that. Okay, so we have recommendations. Now, what to go to the board. Now, remember, this is typically a 2-meeting process. So there may be questions at the board level and we will follow up. What Marge and I realized during this work that it takes a ton of hours, and in some cases takes legal hours and legal billing that we probably don't need. I would suggest on our next series that we go to anything that we revised in like 2021, because we have looked at that, we've done that we take off. We don't need legal to review it again if we just reviewed it last year. And that we kind of simplify this process a little bit, because if we take on like students, there's so many policies, and to pay legal to go through ones that we just affirmed as a board recently seems like, quite frankly, a waste of billing, in my opinion. So Marge, did you have any thoughts?
Also, the advice from Shipman and Goodwin is going to be pretty consistent, that if there's no legal reason to have it, so a policy, they're going to recommend that we repeal it. So I don't know whether it makes sense, again, to look at which policies we don't want to repeal and then have Jessica Smith look and see if there are legal requirements that conflict with it. It would save money and
So
time.
what I would ask is, I think for our next series, which we're going to take on students next, because if we're doing policy, really should make students are up to date, in my opinion, is if everyone starts to review that and flag some for us. Marge and I will also go through and flag local statute. We can have a discussion on anything that's statutory, but I don't think that we need to have legal just say this is in statute one more time and pay to do it. We just found, even on admin, which is a short series, that it can get expensive. So if everyone looks through the student policies next, flags them, we can certainly have a discussion whether it's statute or local, and then we can have Jessica review those. That makes sense to everybody?
So my only question with that, Tara, is, I'm happy not to pay lawyers if we can avoid it, but the question of changes in statute, and for lack of a better term, sort of, I guess, shepherdizing what's changed versus what we have. even since 2021, there could be some changes. Maybe there aren't, I don't know. But I'm not equipped to go do that work and know whether everything is up to date with the current state of play for statutes. So I think that's value we get from the law firm beyond just looking at it. Not sure how we capture that otherwise.
So, Mrs. Sion.
Right. So the
That's fine.
policy, when we did the policy audit, we compared our policies to Shipman and Goodwin's model policies. They send us an update when there are changes. So everything is reflected in the model, in the policy audit, whether we need to make changes. Also, if you look at the policy audit, if it says no model policy, that's going to mean that it's not required.
Yeah.
So do we have that document we can reconcile against?
Yeah, I'll send it to you again, but the board did have it at some point.
Okay.
Yeah. And then as part of Shipman's process with us, when statute changes, they will send over new model policies. So if there has been a statute change, we would get an issuance of a new model policy against statute.
Understood. Okay.
So hopefully that'll simplify the process. And look, if we need to adjust as we go through this, we will. We did it this way because it seemed comprehensive and we found it, maybe we could have gotten it to you all quicker. So we're going to try the next method. And if we need to adjust, I'm very open to committee members saying they need an adjustment or they have some questions. So we'll try the next group a little differently, but if we need to zig and zag, we absolutely will.
Sounds like a good plan.
Great. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay, any public comment today? Seeing none, and there's none online, Michelle?
There are no hands raised at this time.
Great, thank you. All right, with that, we will adjourn. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. We don't really vote, but okay.
So moved.
All right, thanks, everyone.